If you want a fast and easy way to understand Part 1 of the Federal Acquisition Regulations, also known as FAR Part 1, then you must watch this video. Let's dive into it. So FAR Part 1 is specifically about the Federal Acquisition Regulation system. So the system, not just the FAR, but the entire system. It's basically the foundational opening of the FAR. It's pretty dry topic, but it's essential for you to understand in order for you to have a better grasp of the FAR itself and the respect of what it's supposed to be. So the Federal Acquisition Regulation System, the FAR system, was established to standardize policies and procedures for acquisitions by all executive agencies. The FAR system consists of the FAR, which is the primary document, and the agency acquisition regulations that implement or supplement the FAR. We'll talk more about agencies and their supplement regulations in a few minutes. So the guiding principles, the vision of the FAR is to deliver on a timely basis the best value product or service to the customer, which is the U.S. government, while maintaining the public's trust and fulfilling public policy objectives. Participants in the acquisition process are expected to work together as a team and be empowered, meaning they're supposed to be given authority to make decisions within their area of responsibility. We'll talk about the primary roles and their responsibilities later in this video. As with any acquisition process, there's an expectation for a certain level of performance. The basic performance expectations are satisfy the customer, which is the U.S. government, in the terms of cost, quality, and timeliness of the delivery for the product or service, minimize the administrative operating cost, conduct business with integrity, fairness, and openness, and fulfill public policy objectives. So the acquisition team. The purpose of defining the acquisition team is to ensure that participants in the system are identified beginning with the customer and ending with the contractor of the product or service. The team consists of all participants in government acquisition, including not only the representatives of the technical, supply, and procurement communities, but also the customers they serve and the contractors who provide the products and services. And at a high level view, the role of the acquisition team, at least for the government members of the team, must be empowered to make acquisition decisions within their area of responsibility. The authority to make decisions and the accountability for the decisions made to be delegated to the lowest level within the system. And the team must be prepared to perform the functions and duties assigned. It also encourages cooperation and relationships between the government and its contractors, consistent with its overriding responsibility to the taxpayers. The FAR outlines procurement policies and procedures that are used by all members of the acquisition team, both the government and the contractor. So the development of the FAR system is in accordance with the requirements of 41 U.S.C. Chapter 13, titled the Acquisition Councils. The FAR is prepared, issued, and maintained, and the FAR system is prescribed jointly by the Secretary of Defense, the Administrator of General Services, and the Administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, also known as NASA, under their own separate authorities. The most important thing about the FAR is that it applies to all acquisitions of the federal government, as defined in Part 2, which is called Definitions of Words and Terms, which is actually the next video in FAR Part 2, except in areas where it expressly excludes the FAR, and it will be specifically written as such. The FAR is issued as Chapter 1 of Title 48 of the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, and is divided into subchapters, parts, each of which covers a specific aspect of the acquisition process, subparts, sections, and subsections. As you can see in this matrix, the subparts are aligned to a specific group of FAR parts. The numbering system permits the discrete identification of every FAR paragraph. The digits to the left of the decimal point represent the part number. The numbers to the right of the decimal point and to the left of the dash represent in order the subpart, which could be 1 or 2 digits, and the section, which is always 2 digits. The number to the right of the dash represents the subsection. Subdivisions may be used at the section and subsection levels to identify individual paragraphs. The following example illustrates the makeup of a FAR number citation. Note the subchapters are not used with this citation. The FAR is a living document, and with any living document, it's constantly evolving, being updated, changing as the world changes. So revisions are sometimes necessary. Revisions to the FAR will be prepared and issued through the coordinated action of two different councils, the Defense Acquisition Regulation Council, called the DAR Council, and the Civilian Agency Acquisition Council, CAA Council. Responsibility for processing revisions to the FAR is appointed by the two councils so that each council has cognizance over specific parts of subparts. The director of the DAR Council is a representative of the Secretary of Defense, and the chairperson of the CAA Council is a representative of the Administrator of the General Services. Both are discussed further in the next couple of slides. The DAR Council, Defense Acquisition Regulations Council members, includes one legal member and one policy member from each of the below defense agencies and the DAR Council director, the Department of the Army, Air Force, the Navy, Defense Logistics Agency, and Defense Contract Management Agency, which is basically the compliance arm of all of the defense acquisitions. The Civilian Agency Acquisition Council, the CAAC members, includes one member from each of the federal executive departments of the 18 federal agencies and the CAAC chairperson from the GSA. Some of the departments are listed here, like the Department of Commerce, Department of Education, Department of Energy, Labor, Justice, State. These are things that I think most people are familiar with based on news and political, economical discussions within our country, and one member from each of those are represented as a part of the CAA. So because the FAR is a living document and it has to be maintained and it has to be updated, revised, there is a FAR Secretariat. Basically a secretary, similar to how like a board of directors has a secretary on the board who keeps up with the notes and discussions and agenda and updates and kind of keeps things on track. The GSA, the General Services Administration, is responsible for establishing and operating the FAR Secretariat to publish and distribute the FAR through the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR, including a separate online edition with periodic updates. Additionally, the FAR Secretariat is responsible to provide the two councils with centralized services so they can keep a synopsis of current FAR cases and their status, maintain official files, assist parties interested in reviewing the files on completed cases, and performing miscellaneous administrative tasks pertaining to the maintenance of the FAR. Agency compliance with the FAR, in accordance with FAR Part 1.304, is the responsibility of the Secretary of Defense, at least for the military departments and the defense agencies. The Administrator of the General Services is responsible for the civilian departments, except for NASA, and then NASA has its own compliance arm of the Administrator of NASA. So agency supplements. We spoke earlier that the FAR system is made up of the FAR, which is the primary document, and agency supplements. So the FAR plus agency supplements. An agency head may issue or authorize the issuance of agency acquisition regulations that implement or supplement the FAR and incorporate together with the FAR agency policies, procedures, contract clauses, solicitation provisions, and forms that govern the contracting process or otherwise control the relationship between the agency, including any of its sub-organizations, and contractors or prospective contractors. In this picture is 31 different regulations that exist, the FAR being the primary one, and then all the supplementary ones are listed here. The Department of Veterans Affairs is the very last one, Department of Energy, the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, Marines, Special Operations, Agricultural. So many different departments listed here, so many different agencies, all supplements to the FAR. So not only the FAR, but also the regulations associated to that department and or agency. So agency-wide acquisition regulations are published in the Federal Register as required by law, and they're codified as a chapter in Title 48 of CFR. So as you remember earlier, Chapter 1 of Title 48 Federal Acquisition Regulations System is the basic FAR, chapters 1 through 99 technically, but 1 through 51, and the FAR clauses are in 52. And so they align to a numbering system with intention. So coverage in the agency acquisition regulations that implements a specific part, subpart, section, or subsection of the FAR is numbered and titled to correspond to the actual FAR number and title. An example of that is what we have listed here in blue, where the FAR is 52.301-1. So therefore, DFARS for Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations is 252.301. And you'll see in this chart, Chapter 1 is the FAR, and Chapter 2 is the Defense Acquisition Regulations, DFARS. And you can see that it's Chapter 2 right here, but it also has a prefix of 252. So the chapter plus 52 means it's DFARS, and that's what that 252 here means. But you can see how if it implements, it has the same FAR clause number at the end. If it's supplementary material where there's no counterpart in the FAR, so it's, it's codified, their chapter, part, subpart, section, and subsection are with 70s. So an example we have here, supplemental example, is the agency reg does not align to a FAR reg. So you'll still have the 2 for defense, but then they'll start using 70.2 something something, 201.70, 201.370, or even a subsection 201.307-70. So if you see a 70, it's supplementary to the FAR, and then if it's aligned to the same number, it implements. So deviations from the FAR means any one or combination of the following items. And I'll, instead of boring you with 18 paragraphs, it's inconsistent with the FAR, not using a clause when required, modified or altering language that is not authorized by the FAR, the use of language inconsistent with the FAR, the authorization of lesser or greater limitations that's prescribed by the FAR, and the issuance of policies or procedures not incorporating into agency acquisition regulations. Now, the version in the FAR is much more evolved than this, but this is the gist of it. So a deviation means any one or a combination of these type of situations. So there's 2 types of deviations: an individual deviation, which affects only one contract action, and class deviations that affect more than one. So think of individual and class similar to like a lawsuit. When you sue a company by yourself, it's an individual lawsuit. But when you have many people on the same type of lawsuit against an entity or a company, that's a class action. So class is many, individual is one. An example of a class deviation might be the government threshold dollar values. So for example, the SAT value used to be 150,000, and that changed in the summer of 2018, and now it's 250,000. And so when that change happened, it affected many different contract regulations, because so many of them are geared by financial levels thresholds. When something is over a certain threshold, you have to do another level of things. Another example of threshold change was the Truth in Negotiations Act, which we call TINA. It used to be 750,000. It had changed to 2 million, and eventually it'll change more and more. So when an agency knows that it will require a deviation on a permanent basis, it's supposed to propose a FAR revision. Civilian agencies, except for NASA, are supposed to provide a copy to the FAR Secretariat for processing. So public comments. The public has the opportunity and is encouraged to submit written comments on proposed significant revisions to the FAR. I've done that myself when there's been changes posted on the FAR, and it's something that I encourage people in our industry that deal with government contracts on a regular basis and who are tied into policy to do so. Any significant change in the FAR has to be posted for a minimum 30 days, and it includes the text of the revision, the address and phone number of the individual from whom copies can be obtained from, as well as who to send comments to. And the effective date also, if there's temporary pending comments, it'll have the effective date that it'll change after comments are open. Typically, at least 60 days will be given for the most recent comments. Some things to note: if a revision is not significant, it need not to be solicited for comments. And if a revision is urgent, an advance comment may not be needed prior to the effective date. So unless specifically prohibited by another provision of law, authority and responsibility to contract for authorized supplies and services are always vested with the agency head. And the agency head may establish contracting activities and delegate broad authority to manage the agency's functions to heads of such other contracting activities. So contracts may enter into and sign on behalf of the government only by contracting officers. And in some agencies, a relatively small number of high-level officials are designated contracting officers solely by virtue of their position. And then contracting officers below the level of the head of a contracting activity are also selected and appointed by the agency head. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that we would speak about some key roles and their responsibilities. One of the key roles in the acquisition process for any department, any agency, is the contracting officer, and they have the ultimate authority. So the contracting officers have authority to enter into, administer, or terminate contracts and make related determinations and findings, and they're also the only ones who could bind the government, only to the extent that has been delegated to them from the agency head. Some limitations: so the contracting officer shall receive from the appointed authority clear instructions in writing regarding the limits of their authority. Information on the limits of the contracting officer authority shall be readily available to the public and agency personnel, so that could be requested from them directly. No contract can be entered into unless the contracting officer ensures that all requirements of law, executive order, regulations, and all other applicable procedures, including clearances and approvals, have been met. There's a lot of stress and a lot of responsibility on a contracting officer. Like I said, they have all the authority, and it's really somebody that you want to build a great relationship with. It's something that you want to be respectful to. You want to understand how much they have on their plate, and also respect their time. So please be sure to read the instructions of everything that you're required to do and follow them like you're supposed to. Engage them for guidance if needed, but definitely a role that needs to be respected in the industry. So the contracting officer is responsible for ensuring the performance of all necessary actions for effective contracting, ensuring compliance with the terms of the contract, safeguarding of the interests of the United States and its contractual relationships. In order to perform these responsibilities, the contracting office is allowed to have some latitude and exercise business judgment. Contracting officers shall ensure that the requirements of 1.602-1B have been met and that there's sufficient funds and availability for obligation to the contractor. Ensure that contractors receive impartial, fair, and equitable treatment. Request and consider the advice of specialists in audit, law, engineering, information security, transportation, and other fields as appropriate. And designate and authorize in writing and in accordance with the agency procedures a contracting officer representative, basically like the government project manager, on all contracts and orders other than those that are for firm fixed price and for firm fixed price contracts and orders as appropriate, unless the contracting officer retains and executes the core duties themselves. So as I just mentioned, the contracting officer has the authority to delegate and authorize a contracting officer representative, a COR, C-O-R, which is basically the government program manager or project manager. You might have a situation in your organization to where you're the contract person, but you have a program manager who handles the day-to-day operations of the program and consults with you and engages with you on issues, problems, authority needs, and communication needs with the contracting office. So with the government, the contracting officer representative, the COR, has to be a government employee unless otherwise authorized by the agency, has to be certified and maintain certification in accordance with the current Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, FAR requirements, has to be qualified and trained and experienced with the areas of responsibility that are delegated to them. They may not delegate authority to anybody else, but they can assign some duties back to the contracting officer. Has no authority to make any commitments or changes that affect price, quality, quantity, delivery, terms and conditions, anything. This is actually something that is repeated over and over and over in your contract and even by your contract officer. The PM and with the contractor and the PM with the government sometimes have conversations and they say, okay, yeah, we'll just do that or just do this. Well, then it results in a 30-day change in schedule, or then it increases the price of the contractor. The Corps does not have any authority whatsoever to direct change to the contractor except concurrence with anything. They must consult with the contracting officer in order for that to be validated and to be implemented in the contract, and also to make sure that the contractor understands the changes and doesn't have any slip in schedule, quality impact, or time or money impact that would result in a change or modification to the contract. So if you work with your program managers, be sure they understand that their counterpart does not have the authority to change or direct, and that they need to consult with you so that you guys can work with the contracting officer to make sure you guys are on the same page. So now that brings me to our final slide, which is ratification. Ratification, as used in this section, FAR Part 1, means the act of approving an unauthorized commitment by an official who has authority to do so. So an unauthorized commitment means an agreement that is not binding solely because the government representative who made it lacked the authority to enter into that agreement on behalf of the government. So for example, we just talked about your Corps, your PM on the government side, agreeing with you to do something. Well, that's not an authorized situation because the PM doesn't have authority to direct, authorize, change, pivot a scope or anything like that. So that would be considered ratification. So if you're a PM working with your PM on the government side, it's really important that you guys, communicate well, but also say, okay, that's not a part of my scope. Let's bring in contracts so we can get that all tied up, because you don't want to get them in trouble and you don't want to get in trouble yourself. So the ratification process is something you want to avoid, period. It's grounds for termination on the government side. And frankly, in my opinion, if you're authorizing changes that are not in your contract for the government, for your contractor, that should be grounds for termination for you as well. There you have it, FAR Part 1, the Federal Acquisition Systems. The next video in this series is FAR Part 2, Definitions. And if you haven't already, check out the FAR series playlist that has the whole collection so you can watch them all or find specific FAR parts you need to know. Until next time, bye.